Hello, Creepy Cassettes. Welcome back to Creepy Cassetti, your place for horror in reality and beyond. I'm your host, Dee, and if you like this sort of skin crawly content, please smash that like button, the subscribe button, and the notification bell so that you'll know every time I drop another video. This is episode 1 of The Dark Side of. Someone once said, don't meet your heroes. This series is designed to tell you why. We are going to be taking a look at the dark side of celebrities and public figures. Not to crucify or cancel, but to understand that every human owns a dark side, and we need to be cognizant of that in ourselves and others. Today we're going to be discussing the dark side of football player and convicted murderer Aaron Hernandez. We are going to look into what causes someone who seemingly has everything a person could want to risk it all. We are going to take a deep dive into his personal life before and after his rise and fall in the NFL. Aaron Hernandez was born in Bristol, Connecticut on November 6, 1989 to Dennis Hernandez and Terry Valentine Hernandez, the youngest of two boys, including his brother DJ. Mr. and Mrs. Hernandez had a tumultuous relationship, a relationship marred by constant arguments and abuse. Aaron remarked that his mother was always kicking his father out of the house. His house was one of dysfunction, and his parents' arguing was only exacerbated by financial struggles. The Hernandezes married in 1986, divorced in 1991, and remarried in 1996. In 1999, the family dealt with a bankruptcy. Dennis Hernandez was abusive to his wife and kids. His violence was fueled by alcohol, and the boys often found themselves in his line of fire when their performance in school or sports were lacking. But that being said, the boys loved and revered their father. It's also important to mention that Dennis was blatantly homophobic and had no qualms about slinging that sort of derogatory language at his children whenever they so much as moved in a way he deemed effeminate. And that sort of verbal abuse must have been somewhat taxing on Aaron's psyche, being that he and his brother DJ had suffered sexual abuse at the hands of a male perpetrator whose identity they declined to expose. In high school, Aaron secretly explored his sexuality and entered into a well-hidden relationship with teammate Dennis Sansucci, which was not revealed until many years later. So we have a history of physical and sexual abuse, a dysfunctional family dynamic, and confusion about his sexuality compounded by his father's blatant homophobia. He was terrified of his father finding out about his hidden interests. Aaron must have reportedly retained some of his father's sentiments, as he was recorded by friends as making his own tone-deaf remarks and even expressed frustration at his attraction to other men. But even with his home life struggles, Hernandez excelled at football. 2006, his senior year of high school, he managed to gain 24 touchdowns and was considered a football All-American. His performance on the field was impressive, enough that the University of Florida coach Urban Meyer talked his principal into letting the 17-year-old Hernandez graduate more than a semester early. This gave him time to move to Florida and learn the playbook before the season started. But people who knew him remarked that he was not mentally or emotionally ready for the pressures of college. During that year, his father also passed away due to complications of a hernia surgery, although it is not mentioned what those complications were. He and his father were best friends, and he really took his loss hard, so impacted by his father's death that he lashed out, finding ways to seek attention, and his mother even remarked that he had rebellious streak, and he was hard to communicate with at times. Many of his tattoos were dedications to his father. Sometime not long after his father's death, he and his mother became estranged. His mother had started dating another man, Jeffrey Cummings. He was a known drug abuser with a history of domestic violence, but the strangest part was that he was the ex-husband of Aaron's cousin, Tanya Hernandez, and Aaron believed their relationship started before his father's passing. In 2007, his college career began. He spent the majority of his college days partying hard, smoking weed, underage drinking, and getting into fights. Some described him as a bit of an attention seeker. Notably, he had his first recorded run-in with the law when he attempted to skip out on his drink tab at a restaurant. Aaron was still just 17, and he and Tim Tebow went to a restaurant where Hernandez downed 2 drinks and decided to skip out on the tab. He was escorted out of the establishment by an employee. The manager came out to talk to him, and as the manager was walking away, Hernandez sucker punched him, rupturing his eardrum. He was almost brought up on felony battery charges and narrowly escaped, settling the situation with the manager and setting up a deferred prosecution agreement, which kept him from being punished for the charges as long as he met the agreement's requirements. 2007 was also the year he started dating Cheyenne Jenkins, a girl he had known since elementary school, who would later become his fiancée and the mother of his only child. Even though he managed to escape the charges at the restaurant, it would not be his only brush with the law freshman year. He and 2 teammates would be questioned in a shooting that took place outside of a nightclub in Gainesville, Florida. 5 shots sailed into a car containing Randall Carson, Justin Gallagher, Glass and Corey Smith. The car was stopped at a traffic light just outside the club when an assailant on foot walked up to the car and started shooting. Corey Smith was shot in the back of the head. Justin Glass was shot in the arm. Randall Clarkson was unharmed. All the men lived, although I'm sure not without physical and psychological scarring. Hernandez was thought to be a suspect after Carson remarked the guy who shot them was Hawaiian or Hispanic. Hernandez and two of his teammates were questioned by the police. The two teammates were cooperative, answering questions. Hernandez invoked his right to counsel and refused to speak with them. His behavior during the questioning was thought unusual by officers. When they walked into the interrogation room, Hernandez had his head on the table, napping. No charges were filed at the time. Carson rescinded his statement in 2017, stating that he thought Hernandez was a shooter because they had words earlier at the nightclub. The remainder of his time in college was not without its hitches. He'd failed at least one drug test and spent some time on the bench for misconduct. But he also received 5 distinguished collegiate awards for his skill on the field. In 2008, he received the SEC Championship Award. In 2009, he received the John Mackey Award, First Team All-American, BCS National Championship, and the First Team All-Sec. In 2010, he decided to forego his senior year in favor of getting drafted into the NFL. He participated for the first time in the NFL Scouting Combine on January 6, 2010. At some point during the offseason, he tore a back muscle, which rendered him unable to perform any of the physical drills. He returned to the Combine on March 17, 2010, and this time he was able to perform all of the drills. Notably, his performance was rather impressive. In the 40-yard dash, his time ranked 4th of all tight ends at the time, and he showed the best performance of all tight ends, bench pressing 225 pounds for 30 reps. He almost didn't make it onto any team. The word had gotten around that he was a troubled kid, and many of the teams were not willing to take the risk. Some even went as far as to completely strike Hernandez from their draft board. The Boston Globe ran a report in April of that year saying that Hernandez had admitted to a history of marijuana use and multiple failed drug tests. He was candid about his prior failed drug tests and had written letters to interested teams to gain their trust and explaining himself. He even went as far as offering to take weekly drug tests during his first season. And in the 4th round, the New England Patriots decided to take a chance on the talented tight end. Even though the Patriots had been willing to take their chances with him, it was clear that they were not 100% confident in Hernandez's behavior, because when he signed on, it was only for a 4-year, $2.37 million contract with a $200,000 signing bonus. The signing bonus would normally have been in the range of $500,000, but the smaller signing bonus was a precaution to keep the team from losing money should this wild train go off the rails. But they also worked additional incentives into the contract that could bring him another total of $700,000, which would be comparable to that of a 3rd-round pick, but he would have to keep on the straight and narrow to get there. Alas, he had a pretty impressive rookie year. He had 101 receiving yards in one game, making him at the time the youngest player since the 60s to have over 100 receiving yards in a single game. He finished the year with 45 receptions for 563 receiving yards and 6 touchdown receptions over 14 games with 7 starts. By all accounts, he was a very hard-working player, one of the hardest working guys on the team. However, he didn't always get along with the members of his team. He was considered a bit of an outcast, but he made some connections with teammates like Tom Brady and Rob Gronkowski. I'm not going to go terribly far into all of his stats between the end of 2010 season and the entirety of his 2011 season. That's not what we're here for today. But suffice it to say, the Patriots must have been fairly impressed with his performance, because he re-signed a 5-year contract with the team on August 12th of 2012 for $39.8 million and touched hearts by contributing $50,000 of the money to charity close to the hearts of one of the coaches. Here's where we get into his 2 murder charges. Hernandez was known for lashing out the slightest perceived slight. In 2010, he hired 2 friends with criminal records from Bristol, Connecticut to be his assistants. One of those assistants was Alexander Bradley, who was also a known drug dealer. The 2 met via weed sale right before Hernandez was drafted that same year and started smoking together every day. Naturally, their friendship grew from there. They spent most days together smoking, and at one point, Bradley even considered Hernandez to be his best friend. He was also his drug and weapons dealer. It was his and the other assistant's responsibility to keep Hernandez from doing something he'd forget in the clubs and bars he was still frequenting. Not that Bradley would be the best judge of poor decision making. He was in his own altercation in a nightclub that resulted in him getting shot in the leg, dragging himself, injured leg and all, out to his own car, returning to shoot 11 shots into the busy nightclub. And stay tuned, because Bradley is going to come back into the story and be a key player in the later part of this video. On July 16th, 2012, Hernandez and Bradley were hanging out together at the Cure nightclub in the south end of Boston. Not far far from the nightclub, 2 immigrants from Cape Verde, who had also been enjoying the club scene that night, were murdered by a drive-by shooting. Hernandez was not immediately identified as a suspect. The police were aware of his presence at the venue that night, having seen him on surveillance at the club, but it wasn't until June 27, 13 that the police finally questioned him and Bradley about the shooting, and by that point, he was already dealing with a whole different set of charges. So Hernandez was allowed to continue living his best life, and that's exactly what he did. He proposed to his longtime girlfriend, Cheyenne Jenkins, in October 2012, and the two had a little girl named AVL. Just a few weeks later, Hernandez also bought a $1.8 million over 7,000 square foot mansion with in-ground swimming pool in North Attleboro, Massachusetts. But then things started to go downhill. As time progressed, he became increasingly more paranoid. That paranoia manifested in many ways beyond throwing fits in the nightclub. He slept with a big knife by his bed. He even went as far as trying to convince Bill Belichick to transfer him to a team across the country. He believed him and his family to be in danger. His request was denied, but he took other measures such as outfitting a Chevy Suburban to be an armored car and amassing a huge weapon stock, some of those weapons having been acquired by Alexander Bradley. February 13th, 2013, Hernandez and Bradley took a little party trip to Florida. They hung out at a club called Tootsie's in Miami. Allegedly, Hernandez spent about $15,000 that night, and he was expecting that Bradley pay for half. Bradley stated he did not have the money. He woke up in the car a few miles north of Miami in Riviera Beach, Florida, with Hernandez pointing a gun barrel at his face. He reached up to cover his face, and the bullet went through a finger into his right eye and exploded in the socket. He was then left in an industrial park lot to die. He was found the next day by police alive but blinded in his right eye, so naturally he was out for blood. Instead of cooperating with the police, he chose to take matters into his own hands. And so a text thread of over 500 messages between Hernandez and Bradley ensued. Those messages ranged from death threats to extortion to terms of endearment. Hernandez's manager tried to work out a settlement between the two. Bradley asked for $5 million, Hernandez countered $1.5 million, and Bradley countered that offer with $2.5 million, to which Hernandez never responded and instead contacted his lawyer. But after the incident, his paranoia leveled up. He had a high-tech surveillance system set up in his home. This would be the same surveillance system that would be destroyed just a few days after Odin Lloyd was found in an industrial park near Hernandez's mansion. Odin Lloyd was a semi-professional linebacker with the Boston Bandits. He was also the boyfriend of Shania Jenkins, sister of Hernandez's fiancée, Cheyenne. He and Hernandez would have gotten along at some point because they had been clubbing together just a few nights before on June 13th, 2013. Cameras at the Rumors nightclub in Boston from that night showed Hernandez getting angry and storming off at one point. A few minutes later, Hernandez sends texts to two of his friends from Bristol, Connecticut, Carlos Ortiz and Ernest Wallace. He asked that they come down to North Attleboro. He wrote to the men, "You can't trust anyone anymore." One speculation states that Lloyd had uncovered the secrets of Hernandez's sexuality, and he may have thought Lloyd would expose those secrets. The other motive brought forth following the murder was that Lloyd had been talking with people at the club regarding the double homicide from 2012. A few days later, on June 17th, 2013, Hernandez, Lloyd, Ortiz, and Wallace are seen on surveillance leaving Lloyd's residence in a silver Nissan Altima at 2:33 a.m. Lloyd sent his sister 4 text messages between 3:07 a.m. and 3:23 a.m. that read, "You saw who I'm with. Hello? NFL? Just so you know." His sister Shaquila Thibault remarked that she thought that he was bragging. It didn't register that he was giving her a warning until after the unthinkable had already taken place. Another surveillance footage from the industrial park shows the car going in and just a few minutes later leaving again. That evening, a jogger taking a shortcut found Lloyd's body in a gravel pit and notified the police. Lloyd had been shot 7 times in the chest and stomach. Police conducted a search of Hernandez's home that next day. Not much was found during the first search. On June 21st, 2013, a video surfaces of Hernandez and Lloyd together on the night of the murder, and media helicopter footage shows Hernandez heading to a gas station and then to see his lawyer. When it was uncovered that not only had Hernandez destroyed his security system, he had also hired a cleaning crew the day after the murder, police decided to conduct a second search. That search took place on June 23rd, 2013. Police dogs were used to conduct the search, and it took about 4 hours to complete. It was later revealed that Hernandez kept a secret apartment just a few miles from his main home. Ortiz led the police to the 2-bedroom unit. He mentioned that he had left a cell phone there. The police picked up a warrant to locate the phone, and after searching the apartment, they found a box of ammunition on an end arraignment table and applied for more warrants, including one to search a Hummer parked outside of the complex. The police found a white hooded sweatshirt, an item of clothing one of the suspected assailants was wearing the night of the murder. They also found a cranberry-colored baseball cap with a light blue front panel with the word Society written backwards on it. The cap was important because Hernandez had been wearing a similar cap a couple of days before the murder at the nightclub with Lloyd. Further search of the apartment turned up 11 boxes of ammunition, including a .22 caliber, .45 caliber, and 7.62 millimeter rounds. This was an apartment that he used to hold drugs, weapons, and where he would go to chain smoke. Police found what they thought was the vehicle the men had been in the night of the murder. They also searched a lake in Bristol, Connecticut for the murder weapon, which did not turn up. Despite Hernandez attempting to clear himself with head coach Bill Belichick and owner Robert Kraft, he was barred from showing up at Gillette Stadium. The team had already discussed letting Hernandez go if he was brought up on charges related to the case. On June 26, 2013, Hernandez was arrested on 1 count of first-degree murder, a count of carrying a firearm without a license, 2 counts of possessing a firearm without a firearm identification card, and 2 counts of possessing large-capacity firearm. Within an hour and a half of his arrest, he was released from the New England Patriots. With his release came numerous financial losses, including the Patriots doing whatever they could to recoup some of the loss incurred by Hernandez's early release from the contract, and sponsors like Cytosport, makers of muscle milk, relieving him of his contract. Just one day after his arrest, the NFL store stopped selling memorabilia related to Hernandez. Carlos Ortiz was also arrested on June 27, 2013, and Wallace was arrested on June 28, 2013, initially charged with accessory, and then those charges were upgraded to first-degree murder. Odin Lloyd was laid to rest on June 29, 2013, after a ceremony at the Church of Holy Spirit in Boston. His mother, sister, family, friends, and even his teammates showed up to send him off. Some teammates even chanted his name as pallbearers placed his casket in the back of the hearse. During a later interview with his mom, she said the last time she saw him was on Father's Day. He had showed up to thank her and honor her on the day for being both his father and mother. He even showered her with love and compliments. On August 12, 2013, Hernandez was indicted for Lloyd's murder by a grand jury in Bristol, Massachusetts, and pled not guilty. While Hernandez was in jail awaiting trial for Lloyd's murder, the double homicide from 2012 came back to haunt him, and so did Alexander Bradley. Bradley filed a lawsuit against Hernandez for the shooting earlier in 2013. He was also brought up on witness intimidation charges as a result of shooting Bradley, and was thought that he had shot Bradley to keep him from speaking up about the double homicide. The De Abreu and Furtado court case went to trial on July 23, 2013. Alexander Bradley was the prosecution's star witness. He had been offered immunity in favor of testifying against Hernandez, but his already sketchy credibility was called into question multiple times during the interview with the court, mainly by Hernandez's lawyer, Jose Baez. Baez made claim that Bradley had actually been the shooter, stating that the real reason behind the murder was a drug deal gone south, that he accepted immunity to cover him as the real shooter. Bradley argued that the altercation started when either De Abreu or Furtado bumped into Hernandez in the club, spilling his drink. The surveillance footage from the night of the murder was not consistent with Bradley's recollection of events. When the tapes were reviewed from the night, it was found out that Hernandez had not stayed long in the club at all. Instead, he had gone in for a few minutes, took a picture with a fan, and then he left. It took months of deliberation and the trial having been even suspended at one point before Hernandez was eventually acquitted of the murders of the two men and for the charge of witness intimidation. The acquittal was due to there not being enough definitive evidence to prove that Hernandez was actually the shooter. Instead, he walked away with one charge for illegal possession of a firearm. The Lloyd trial began on January 29th of 2015 in Fall River, Massachusetts. It was a case full of twists and turns, one which saw an NBC News truck following the jury van and leading to a band of news channels taking pictures during the trial. It also introduced 2 other characters into the spiel, Cheyenne Jenkins and Tanya Cummings Singleton, Hernandez's cousin. The 2 were charged with accessory after the fact for assisting Hernandez following the crime. Jenkins was also charged with perjury and then given immunity if she testified against Hernandez. Singleton's charges were eventually all dropped. Susan Garsh, the presiding judge, threw out the text messages from Odin as part of the prosecution's argument, stating it did not include enough evidence to prove that Lloyd feared for his life. The judge also threw out evidence from 2 cell phones and 3 tablets obtained from Hernandez's home due to issues with the warrants. The judge also threw out ammunition evidence obtained from the apartment and Ortiz's cell phone for warrant issues. The prosecution suffered another blow when Garsh banned evidence from the 2012 murders evidence to be used as part of the trial, but the prosecution had a few wins. Garsh kept the evidence from the cell obtained from Hernandez, since that phone was willingly provided, and she denied a motion from the defense to change the venue. Ultimately, after many hours of deliberation, Hernandez was found guilty of the murder and 5 weapon charges on April 15, 2015. He was given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Ernest Wallace and Carlos Ortiz were acquitted of Lloyd's murders but found guilty of accessory, and both were sentenced to 4.5 to 7 years in prison. Hernandez was transferred to the Souza Baranowski Correctional Center in Lancaster, Massachusetts. He did oddly well in jail, remarking to his mother and Cheyenne that he was comfortable in jail and felt surprisingly relaxed. But while he might have found some comfort in jail, he was still dealing with some internal struggle, something that became very clear when on April 19, 2017, he was found hanging from a sheet in his cell and pronounced dead. His cell was in disarray. Cardboard had been placed under the door and shampoo spilled on the floor to make it harder for anyone to enter the room. There was also a pyramid drawn in blood on the wall of the cell with an all-seeing eye. He left 3 notes and a Bible for Cheyenne, his daughter, and other family. Those notes were released to his loved ones. There was no indication prior to his suicide that he was at risk of completing such an act, and it's thought that his struggles with sexuality were a contributing factor in that choice to take his own life. He was fearful of how he would be perceived in jail if they found out about his preference. A few days prior to his suicide, sports reporter Michelle McPhee appeared on Kirk and Callahan radio show and made comments that hinted at Hernandez's secret sexuality. While Hernandez never publicly came out, according to his brother DJ, he allegedly came out to his mother, from whom he had been estranged for a few years following his father's death, and his fiancée while he was behind bars. Before his end, he made sure to take care of his family. He had his lawyer set Cheyenne and his child up with $3,000 a month, a sum of $50,000 as well, and asked the lawyer to help Cheyenne find more affordable housing. After Hernandez's death, an autopsy was performed by Boston University. He was found to have stage 3 CTE. CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy, is defined as progressive degenerative disease of the brain found in people with a history of repetitive brain trauma, often athletes, including symptomatic concussions as well as asymptomatic subconcussive hits to the head that do not cause symptoms. It used to be called punch-drunk syndrome back when it had only been identified in boxers, per the BU CTE Center. So he had a highly progressed version of this already debilitating brain disorder. Only 2 concussions were recorded in his football career. However, there is no telling how many other hits he took to the head in his lifetime between sports, fighting, and potentially stemming from childhood abuse. The problem with CTE is it is a condition that at this time there is no way to diagnose before death. It is only via autopsy that the condition can be identified. Meanwhile, people can go for months, years, or even decades with the condition long after their last brain trauma or the end of their athletic career. A stage 3 diagnosis is an especially severe diagnosis with someone of his brain age, and most assuredly would have contributed to the issues with his behavior. Sam Gandy of Mount Sinai Hospital in New York said, "It's impossible for me to look at the severity of CTE in Mr. Hernandez's brain and not think that they had profound effect on his behavior." Hernandez's conviction was vacated in May 2017 due to an MA law that erased his convictions should the defendant die before he has exhausted all options for appeal, known as abatement ab initio. His conviction was reinstated in March 2019 by MA Supreme Judicial Court. This is part of the reason why I say that we aren't here to crucify or cancel. Humans are incredibly complicated. Not every murderer has the same drive or reasons to kill. Since the motive behind Lloyd's murder was not officially identified, we may never know what the true reason behind his slaying was. Suffice it to say, I'm sure it was a terrible, terrible loss to his family and friends and teammates, as they showed out majorly in love for his dream of possession. But what we do know is that in Hernandez's final years of life, he was dealing with a serious brain condition that impaired his judgment and caused paranoia. We can also speculate that having grown up in a household that abhorred homosexuality can leave lasting scars on a person who is struggling with their own sexuality. And while these things are no real excuse for his actions, and trust me, I won't make any for him, there was always more to the story than we can ever actually be sure of. This was a dark one, guys, and I'm sorry, but I do hope that you guys got some insight, and I hope that you stay tuned for the next episode of The Dark Side of. Take care.